As the tension on the battlefield reached its peak, Kane took his fighting stance with his daggers ready, preparing to face Imperial Hound 6. Raul watched quietly while thinking about the situation. He wondered what Kane thought about this fight. The enemy was not an ordinary opponent but an expert fighter whose tattoos were activated and who had entered a berserk state, making him even more dangerous. Still, Raul sensed that a trace of emotion remained within him. He questioned whether Kane would accept such a challenge. Kane's body began to glow with a faint green aura, and energy wrapped around his daggers as he spoke with calm determination. He said that he was honored to be trusted with this task, and that for the sake of their fallen comrades he would defeat the enemy with his own hands. Imperial Hound 6 immediately charged forward, driven by his berserk state and attacking with overwhelming force. Kane met the attack head-on, his daggers colliding with the strike and sending waves of energy and dust across the battlefield. At that moment, Jake approached Raul and reported that they had eliminated all the Imperial Knights and Demon Cavalry below. Raul turned to him with relief and remarked that it had ended faster than expected, praising everyone for their good work. As they watched the duel, Jake commented that the berserk monster seemed to have the advantage, and asked if everything would be all right. Raul kept his eyes on the fight and thought that Kane was defending far better than expected, and that the battle would be decided soon. Jake then called out teasingly to Kane, saying that if Kane needed the help of a white knight, he should just ask. Kane, embarrassed and irritated by the comment, turned sharply and growled that help was not necessary. In an instant he moved with lightning speed and slashed Imperial Hound 6 across the body. The berserk warrior screamed in pain as blood spimmed and he dropped to his knees, though his dark aura still remained. Kane then turned toward Jake and declared confidently that he was more than enough on his own. Raul nodded in approval and said it had been an excellent fight, adding that Kane's skills had improved greatly. Kane replied humbly that he believed his performance had been shameful. Raul then shifted his attention to the fallen enemy and said that this was not the end. He activated his radiant skill aura, and a golden dagger shot forward, piercing Imperial Hound 6 a body. Slowly, the dark, blood-stained aura began to fade. Kane watched in silence, realizing that the attack had cut off the demonic energy possessing the hound. Raul ordered his knights to remove the corrupted power armor and carry the fallen soldier away, noting that he was still breathing. With the armor on the ground, Raul extended his hand and his regnator armor absorbed the hound's power. Feeling his strength increase, he muttered that this confirmed his suspicions. He then turned to the forest fairy Ravel, who was examining the armor, and asked for her opinion. Ravel answered that according to the system window she was viewing, Regnator needed to absorb power armor contaminated with demonic energy to evolve to the next stage. She said she had expected this outcome. When Raul asked if there were any other changes, she replied that they would know once the digestion process was complete, but that this amount alone was clearly not enough. Raul reassured her, saying they would have many chances to obtain more in the future. He then turned to Jake and Kane and told them to finish things quickly and head back, reminding them that there was still a lot to handle. Both responded together, calling him Master. Raul handed Kane the mask of Imperial Hound 6 and said that although it might be troublesome, he needed Kane to do this one more time. Kane agreed confidently, saying it was his speciality. He put on the mask and instantly transformed perfectly into the form of Imperial Hound 6. Raul thought to himself that it was time to eliminate the pests hiding inside the castle. Meanwhile, inside the castle, nobles and high-ranking members were gathered. The crowd whispered among themselves, wondering if something terrible had happened to the family head. Others warned against saying such ominous things, and suggested that the attackers of the inner castle might have been discovered. At that moment, Weiron the Golden Bear Knight arrived and asked for everyone's attention. He explained that he had gathered them to hear their opinions on an important matter involving a magical message that had arrived the previous evening. The nobles gasped in shock when they learned it was from Viscount Jaden. The messenger explained that Jaden had left the family to wander foreign lands but had never forgotten his duty. During his travels he had trained knights and soldiers in preparation for the day he might be needed. After hearing about the family's crisis caused by the unprecedented gate incident and the serious illness of the family head, he had mobilized his forces and was now on his way to aid the county. Baron Jared de Ashton, an elder council member of House Ashton, shouted angrily and demanded to know what the message was, calling it a long piece of nonsense. He raged that the traitor had no right to set foot on their land again. The young man with golden hair, Baron Isaac, answered calmly that there was no need to cling to past events. Jared roared back that this was exactly something they should dwell on, since it involved a traitor. Isaac replied that although Viscount Jaden's actions had harmed the main family, they should consider whether it was right to reject someone who had come to help in their current situation. Weiron then spoke in a steady voice, saying that the decision should really be made by the Count or the Count's representative. However, he added that the situation was urgent, as scouts reported that Viscount Jaden and the lords supporting him would arrive at Conferred Castle the next day. Jared and the other nobles were shocked. Jared exclaimed in disbelief, while Baron Isaac asked whether such a rude man was bringing troops into the county without permission. He then asked if there had been any fighting or looting, whereon replied that there were no reports of anything like that. Isaac pressed on, asking what the real problem was since Jaden was not forcing his way in, which suggested he did not intend harm. Another noble suggested that it might be better to accept Jaden for the moment and talk things through later when the Count's representative returned, saying that turning away someone offering help was not fitting for a noble house. Jared, flustered, shouted that such thinking was ungrateful and accused them of forgetting all the kindness the Count's family had shown. Isaac shook his head and said that this kind of outdated thinking was slowly destroying the family by letting emotions cloud judgment. Another noble stepped forward and agreed, saying it was time to put an end to these bad habits. Seeing more people agree with Isaac, Jared grimly thought that siding with such unreasonable views would lead to something terrible happening in the county. The Ashton family was no ordinary noble house. As a border count, they served as the western shield of the kingdom and were responsible for defending the land against the Forbidden Zone. Because of this duty, the royal family had given them special privileges. Several territories paid taxes directly to the Count instead of the crown, and the Count only sent part of that to the kingdom. He raised and commanded his own army, and any land reclaimed near the Forbidden Zone automatically became his. He even had the authority to appoint lords. With so much power, the Ashton household ruled over many vassal families, and people often called it a small kingdom, with territory as large as the Korean peninsula. In such a vast domain, nobles naturally fought over rights and interests, and factions formed based on politics. Before leaving the estate, Raul had warned Philip to keep an eye on relatives who spoke loudly in his absence, saying they would do anything for a share of power. Baron Isaac, however, argued that since they were family, they should talk things through directly. Philip then stepped forward and bowed slightly, asking forgiveness for interrupting. He said he had just received contact from the acting count and would deliver his orders. The hall fell silent. Philip asked everyone to look at the screen on the wall. A large screen lit up, showing the actor Dylan. Dylan addressed the people of Conferred Castle, apologizing for the delay and introducing himself as the acting count. He thanked them for carrying out their duties during the turmoil and announced several decisions made at the meeting. The crowd loomed forward as he continued. He ordered that all gates of Conferred Castle be closed immediately, with no one allowed to enter or leave. He then appointed Chief Knight Weiron as temporary commander of the castle, stating that all forces inside must obey Weiron's orders until the commander-in-chief or his own unit arrived. Any violations would be punished under wartime law. The screen then went dark. Philip lowered his head and said that the briefing was over and everyone was dismissed. Baron Isaac's face darkened and he turned and left without saying a word. Philip watched him go with a grim look, thinking that if they could have backed down quietly, none of this would have happened. That night in the meeting room of Baron Isaac's mansion, Isaac sat at the head of a long table and asked whether the current troop positions had been confirmed. Devante, the commander of the Guard Corps and a chain knight, nodded and said that the Count's central army was fully stationed in the inner castle. The guard forces held the two outer walls, and the Silver Bear Knights were guarding the outer gate. Baron Duane, the captain of the guard, stroked his beard and remarked that concentrating the main forces in the inner castle worked in their favor. Isaac then asked Devante who had ordered the Silver Bear Knights to be stationed outside. Devante replied that it seemed the temporary commander had requested it from their knight commander. Isaac then turned to another man and asked whether that would be a problem. Baron Lamar, the vice commander of the Chain Knights, answered confidently that it would not. He said that several Silver Bear Knights had already been brought over to their side, and dealing with the remaining ones who were separated would not be difficult. Isaac leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. The Chain Knights were a probationary knight order waiting to be assigned to regular orders. They were also in charge of the Guard Corps at Conferred Castle and other important forts. This meant that apart from the elite knight orders, all other forces were already under their control. Isaac said this was good. He stated that they would leave the Silver Bear Knights to Baron Lamar and the Chain Knights. One noble raised a concern and asked whether it was really safe to ignore the inner castle. He worried that without securing the manor, everything else would be meaningless. Isaac calmly explained that they were not there to start a civil war. He said that once Baron Jaden entered the castle, legitimacy would come naturally. Baron Jaden was bringing several hundred knights, and even if they had to force their way in, taking the manor would be easy. After that, they would seize the families of the county's key figures as hostages. A silver-haired noble nodded and said that this would prevent the Central Army and the elite knight orders from acting. Isaac agreed and added that once the balance shifted, the surrounding vassals would have no reason to support Dylan. He told everyone to prepare themselves because the true master of the county, Baron Jaden, would soon arrive. One by one the nobles left the meeting room. When the door closed behind the last of them, a faint smile appeared on the face of Baron Lamar, who was actually Kane, perfectly disguised through his shape-shifting ability. The next morning at Conferred Castle, a Silver Bear Knight burst into the operations room shouting that disaster had struck. Wei Ron, the temporary commander, immediately stood up and asked what had happened. The knight saluted unsteadily and reported that a coup had taken place. He explained that a blood-soaked Silver Bear Knight had arrived at the inner gate moments earlier and said that rebels and traitorous Silver Bears had seized all the outer gates. Baron Carlo, commander of the Silver Bear Knights, slammed his fist on the table and angrily asked how such a disgrace could happen, bringing shame to their name. Philip urgently asked where Captain Duane was. The knight replied bitterly that Duane appeared to have joined the rebels. He explained that as soon as the news spread, Duane had gone out, claiming he would assess the situation and never came back. Wei Ron held his head and said that Baron Jaden was expected to arrive around noon. Baron Carlo grabbed the hilt of his sword and swore that he would kill every traitor. He argued that if they could break through even one gate before the enemy gathered more forces, they could end the siege. Wei Ron ordered him to stop and said their top priority was protecting the Count's household. He warned that a reckless attack would doom them all, and that if they were ambushed like before, everything would fall apart. Carlo ground his teeth in frustration. Philip supported Wei Ron, saying the commander was right and that if fighting broke out inside the castle, both soldiers and civilians would suffer. Carlo angrily asked what they were supposed to do and whether they should just sit and watch Jaden's forces march in. A calm voice answered from the doorway saying that of course they could not do that. Raul entered and said they had all suffered enough. The knights stared at him in shock and asked how he was there. Raul smiled faintly and said he had come to tell them that he had a way to resolve the situation. Some time later at the outer walls of Conferred Castle, a group of Silver Bear Knights stood wrapped in robes. Some were loyal while others had already been swayed by Baron Isaac and Baron Duane. Baron Isaac and Baron Duane arrived at the wall, and one of the knights called out, asking the captain of the guard what the situation was like. Duane asked in return, and the guard handed him a small scope saying he would have to see for himself. When Duane looked through it, he froze. No soldiers were preparing outside the inner castle. The strange silence made him uneasy. Seeing his reaction, Isaac narrowed his eyes and asked if there was a problem. Duane muttered that there should have been some response and wondered why it was so quiet. Isaac sighed and said they must have already realized the situation. He remarked that it was strange, but suggested that the temporary commander was probably hesitating and lacked confidence in his own judgment. Duane quietly said he hoped that was all, though his thoughts raced. He found it strange that even an incompetent commander would normally send an envoy to test their intentions. He wondered if they planned to provoke direct conflict, but dismissed it as foolish since they had hundreds of knights and held both military and political advantage. He thought that if Count Melvin were still alive, none of this would have happened. Before he could think further, a massive magic circle appeared above the outer wall. The guard stumbled back and shouted that something was coming out. A projection formed, and Raul's image appeared above the battlements. Raul cleared his throat and asked everyone if they could hear him clearly. Duane's face twisted in shock as he remembered earlier in the operations room when Raul had stood calm and steady and said there was a way to resolve the situation. When others protested that the situation was too unfavorable, Raul had firmly said that there would be no battle inside the castle. He explained that things were not as bad as they seemed because most soldiers on the outer walls were simply following orders. Wei Ron had been confused and asked what he meant. Raul explained that the ones who seized the gates were only some chain knights and nobles. This meant that most guards did not even realize they had been dragged into a rebellion. He concluded that all they needed to do was awaken their sense of duty. Raul's broadcast echoed across the outer castle walls. He said that Ashton County hoped no one would spill pointless blood. He reminded the soldiers that their duty was to protect their families and neighbors, not to fight their own comrades. He warned them not to be misled by a small group of shameless traitors. Baron Isaac slammed his fist against the wall and cursed, demanding that the broadcast be stopped. However, soldiers were already stepping back from their positions and refusing orders. Isaac's face tightened as he realized Raul was labeling them as traitors, and that they were losing control. Raul continued, promising in his own name that no soldier who had been forced into rebellion against their will would be punished. Isaac shouted desperately at the troops, telling them not to be fooled and claiming that Raul was lying. He insisted that the true rebels were those who had seized the inner castle. The soldiers did not answer. Many of them quietly turned their formation inward, no longer loyal to Isaac's faction. Duane felt his confidence fading. He admitted to himself that events were not going their way, but he believed they still held the gates and that time favored them. He thought that once Baron Jaden arrived, everything would change, since Raul lacked the strength to retake the castle. At the inner gate, several nobles arrived with their troops. A knight demanded to know their allegiance. A brown-haired noble introduced himself as Tyranian de Ashton, and said he had heard the broadcast and come to help suppress the traitors. A red-haired noble named Zenito Talon also requested to join the suppression force. Another knight with flowing golden hair mocked the rebels and said he had come to see the fools who dared to revolt. Soon after, a guard rushed into the operations room and reported to Sir Wayron that over 2,000 reinforcements had arrived at the inner castle. The agitator had finished organizing them, and everyone wanted to punish the traitors at the outer walls. Wayron breathed out slowly, noting that everything was unfolding exactly as Lord Raul had predicted. Meanwhile, at the outer wall, several rebel knights whispered nervously. They wondered aloud if others had seen the forces inside the inner castle and questioned whether they were truly about to start a civil war. Some decided they were done, claiming they had only been following orders. They dropped their weapons and fled. Their commander shouted after them, accusing them of direct disobedience. Inside the inner walls, knights raised their swords and called for the traitors who had dared rebel against the count's house to be struck down. Their battle cry echoed throughout the city. On the outer wall, Baron Isaac and Baron Duane watched the overwhelming force gathering before them. Isaac swallowed and asked Duane what they should do, admitting they could not stop a suppression force of that size. He reminded him that Baron Jaden would arrive soon. Duane stayed silent for a long time, looking at the trembling soldiers behind him whose morale had shattered at the sight of the united inner castle forces. Finally, he ordered the archers to prepare fire arrows, and told the men to gather oil and prepare for fire. Isaac stared at him in horror and urged him to think clearly, pointing out that there were homes below and that setting fires would be disastrous. Duane snapped back that he was thinking rationally. He argued that now they had been branded traitors, there was no reason to hold back. By burning the gates and city streets, they could at least buy time. He said that if they lost, they would die anyway, so all they could do was fight to the bitter end. Isaac hesitated, torn between fear and reason. He warned that burning the castle would cost them the support of neutral nobles. Duane, driven to desperation, scoffed and said that they were about to die, so it no longer mattered. He claimed that in the chaos no one would know who started the fires and that excuses could be made later. What mattered was reuniting with Baron Jaden. Isaac fell silent, understanding the grim truth of Duane's words. At last he turned away and muttered that he would give the orders. Duane replied coldly in approval. As Isaac turned to leave, Baron Lamar arrived. Though he was actually Cain in disguise, Isaac immediately brightened and welcomed him, saying the timing was perfect and asking for help. He told Lamar to order some chain knights to use oil and set the streets on fire so they could break the gates amid the confusion. Before he could finish, Cain drew his sword in a single smooth motion and struck downward, slicing into Isaac's arm. The Baron collapsed with a cry as blood splattered across the stones. Duane froze in shock and demanded to know what was happening. Cain glared at both of them with open disgust, saying he could no longer tolerate listening to them. Isaac, clutching his injured arm, weakly asked what was going on. Cain did not answer. Instead, he raised his voice and ordered his knights to seize all the rebels present. The men who had infiltrated the rebel forces immediately turned and attacked the traitorous knights. Baron Duane acted on instinct. Drawing his sword and charging forward, Cain blocked the strong blow easily, their blades clashing loudly as sparks flew. Duane cursed him for betrayal, but Cain only smirked and mocked him, questioning who really had the right to call someone a traitor. Duane narrowed his eyes. Cain's movements felt wrong, too smooth and too mocking. Suddenly he realized the truth. Cain was not Lamar. He was certain of it because he would never fail to recognize someone he had known for years. With a powerful swing, Duane forced Cain to step back a few paces. But Cain only laughed and said that Duane had realized the truth far too late. Before Duane could respond, he sensed someone behind him. He turned quickly and barely managed to block a heavy attack. The force of it sent pain through his arms. He wondered who could swing a sword with such terrifying strength. When he turned fully, he saw Jake standing there, his eyes cold and sharp. Jake asked how Duane was still standing and mocked him, calling him a traitor and addressing him as a former senior. Sweat ran down Duane's face as Jake stepped closer and said that ever since Duane left the Golden Bear Knights he had gone mad and was doing things he would never have dared to do 10 years ago. Duane stared at Jake in shock, wondering when he had become so strong. Just 2 years ago, Duane could have easily defeated him. At that moment, Cain's body shimmered as he returned to his true form. He walked up to Jake and asked if the two of them knew each other. Jake replied vaguely that they did, but not on good terms. Meanwhile, the remaining rebel knights were defeated and tied up. Baron Duane laughed bitterly, and said that since Jake had appeared, Raul must be here as well, being played with by a mere brat. He admitted to himself that he had truly grown old. Cain became angry and warned him to watch his words when speaking about the master. Jake stepped past Cain, his expression turning deadly. In an instant he rushed forward and punched Duane in the face with overwhelming force. Duane spat blood and fell unconscious. Jake then opened the guild communication channel and reported that the rebels who had taken the outer walls had been suppressed. Raul calmly praised everyone and ordered that all rebels be locked in the castle's underground prison, with guards placed at the estates of every family involved. Jake acknowledged the order and closed the channel. Soon after, more reports came in, stating that all nobles and Knight Order members involved in the rebellion had been arrested. Raul praised the work and said the evidence was solid, leaving the rebels no way to deny their crimes. Privately, he thought that the filth within the main house was finally being cleared away. Now only one unwanted guest remained. Raul asked where Viscount Jaden was, noting that he should arrive within an hour. Weyron answered him. Raul stood up and decided it was time to make preparations. Baron Carlo, the commander of the Silver Bear Knights, stepped forward and said he would accompany Raul. Raul briefly studied him, noting that despite losses and traitors among his knights, Carlo was still trying to take responsibility. Philip approached Raul quietly and asked what he planned to do. Raul replied that for now they would try to talk, since the man was, at least in name, his elder uncle. Philip then asked what they would do if the other side attacked recklessly. Raul's eyes hardened as he said they would wipe them out without mercy. Far from the castle, Viscount Jaden and his knights marched steadily toward Conferred Castle, unaware of what awaited them. Some time later, while still a few kilometers away, Viscount Jaden stopped and looked ahead, searching for a signal. He turned to Baron Tate and asked if there was still no contact. Baron Tate replied that the last message had come 2 hours earlier and urged him to stay calm, suggesting that the fighting was likely so intense that no one had time to send a magic orb. Viscount Jaden's son agreed, saying that even the weakest forces could not possibly hold the outer walls for 2 or 3 hours. Even if things had gone badly, the defenders would have suffered heavy losses fighting among themselves. Viscount Jaden agreed and said that this explanation made sense. The group then continued toward the castle. When they finally arrived, shock spread across their faces. They exchanged uneasy looks as they took in the sight before them. The Golden Bear Knights were standing guard at the front gate. Weyron stepped forward and announced that he was the temporary commander of Conferred Castle. He declared that no one would be allowed to enter without permission, and ordered them to leave. For a brief moment, silence followed. Then Viscount Jaden spoke in a sharp but controlled voice. He said that he understood Weyron's determination to protect the castle but criticized him for lacking judgment. He claimed that he had come only to protect his 6 siblings and the castle, and questioned what right someone outside the Count's household had to block his way. He insisted that the acting Count had ordered that no one be allowed inside except authorized people, and demanded that Weyron stop causing trouble and step aside. Those words only fueled Viscount Jaden's anger. He raised his voice and shouted, asking who Weyron thought he was to decide whether he could stay or leave. He ordered the gate to be opened immediately. In response, the knights quickly took up their fighting stances. At that moment, Raul arrived and calmly stated that Viscount Jaden would not be allowed to enter the Count's castle. When Viscount Jaden saw Raul, his body visibly stiffened, and shock and unease flashed across his face. Raul introduced himself, explaining that this was their first meeting. He said that he was Raul Ashton, the Count's 3rd son and the current temporary lord of Conferred Castle. Viscount Jaden ground his teeth in frustration, thinking bitterly that this crafty man was supposed to have returned to his own territory. Speaking aloud, he accused Raul of failing to learn from his father how to treat his elders. Raul gave a faint smile, but his expression soon turned serious. He replied that if Viscount Jaden truly wanted respect as an elder, he should not have betrayed the family. Raul reminded him that his name had already been removed from the family register, yet he still acted without shame. Hearing this, Viscount Jaden's eyes darkened as he clenched his teeth. Raul then signaled for the letter. Weyron immediately handed it to him, and Raul began reading it aloud, calling out the names. Viscount Jaden, Baron Esteban, Baron Ken, Baron Amos and Baron Jun. As their names were spoken, the barons stiffened, fear spreading across their faces as they began to tremble. Raul continued, stating that those named had committed rebellion by bringing in outside forces and moving troops without permission. In the name of acting Count Dylan Ashton, he ordered them to disband immediately. One of the barons cried out nervously, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. He insisted that he had only been escorting the Count's elder brother and that calling it a rebellion was ridiculous. Raul replied coldly that if they were truly innocent, they should come to the Count's castle and prove it. If they had no intention of escalating the situation, they were to leave at once. The baron fell silent and glanced uneasily toward Viscount Jaden. After a brief pause, Viscount Jaden suddenly burst into laughter. He remarked that this was a heavy blow to him, and since neither side was willing to give in, the matter clearly would not end there. He proposed settling the issue with a 5-on-5 knightly duel, saying it was a fair solution. Raul felt tense inside and immediately understood what the proposal meant. A knightly duel was a formal tournament used to judge disputes that the law could not settle. It stood between personal duels and full-scale war, allowing the outcome to be decided through honor and accepted by both sides. Outraged, Weyron shouted that someone without honor had no right to speak of a knightly duel. Viscount Jaden replied that he believed the proposal would not put them at a disadvantage. If that method was unacceptable, he said, then there was no choice but to fight it out on the spot. Raul could only see it as a nuisance. At that moment, Jake, who was standing beside him, sent a message through the guild channel, suggesting that it would be better to simply fight and wipe them out. He even volunteered to lead the charge. Raul admitted to himself that he wanted to do exactly that, but he knew the decision was not so simple. Cain responded to Jake, warning against a direct clash. He said that their losses would be severe. Jake questioned this, pointing out that Raul's knights outnumbered the enemy 2-1. Cain then explained the real problem. They were missing the most important factor. All of Viscount Jaden's knights were equipped with power armor. That realization made Jake uneasy, and Raul also understood the seriousness of it. Power armor was the true threat. Although they had gathered some of their own, the numbers were far too small. Even if a battle broke out, the castle walls would suffer heavy damage from armored knights. Fighting here would mean accepting massive losses. Raul knew that a proper battle had to be fought on chosen ground at a chosen time. Letting out a slow sigh, Raul finally asked Viscount Jaden what he wanted. Viscount Jaden replied that if his side won, a few lords, including himself, would be allowed to enter the inner castle to meet the count. If they lost, they would quietly withdraw their troops. In his heart, Viscount Jaden reflected that since they had come this far, they at least needed to fulfill their stated goal of paying their respects. Only then could they look for future opportunities. Though they were treated as outsiders now, everything would change if Melvin died. What he needed was a clear reason to aim for the next countship. Raul remained silent for a moment before giving his answer. He said that they would accept the knightly duel. Hearing this, Weiran and the other knights looked at Raul in confusion over his decision. Meanwhile, Viscount Jaden's lips curved into a dark smile as he thought that everything was unfolding exactly as he wanted. He believed that today, in this very place, he would clearly prove that Raul's path was wrong. Feeling pleased, he nodded and announced that the negotiations would begin. He then ordered Baron Tate to take care of the formal procedures. Baron Tate stepped forward and announced that under continental law, the knightly duel would use a best-of-5 format, with the first side to win 3 matches being declared the victor. He explained that each match would end when one fighter could no longer continue or formally admit defeat. After that, he asked whether anyone objected to these terms. Raul calmly replied that he had no objections. Baron Tate smiled and confirmed that everything was settled. The duel was scheduled to take place in 30 minutes on the plains outside the castle. Both sides were instructed to finish their preparations and gather at the castle gates. With the terms agreed upon, Raul and his knights returned inside and the massive doors closed behind them. Inside the castle, several knights gathered around Raul as he turned to face them. Weiran spoke first, offering that the Golden Bear Knights should take the lead. Baron Carlo, the commander of the Silver Bear Knights, added that his order was just as confident. A Chain Knight then spoke hesitantly, apologizing before asking whether the Chain Knights might also be given a chance, even if only to raise the morale of the reserve forces who would one day form the backbone of the county. Raul looked at their eager faces and remained silent, thinking that everyone was full of confidence. As knights who valued honor above all else, it was natural that they wanted to step forward at such a moment. Just then, Jake stepped out and asked Raul to leave the matter to him, stating that he would personally crush the traitors. Raul refused at once. Startled, Jake asked for the reason. Raul thought that strictly speaking the first knights, Jake's order, answered directly to him. For an issue of this scale, he felt it was better to resolve it through the Count's authority, with as little direct involvement from himself as possible. To firmly secure control over the county, the strength and determination of the county's household needed to be displayed. Since Raul had already declared independence as the Lord of Calypso Castle, stepping in personally would only complicate the situation. As he considered who should be sent instead, a voice suddenly called out from behind him, addressing him as Baron Raul. He turned toward the speaker. The scene then shifted to Viscount Jaden's camp barracks. Baron Tate remarked that things had become complicated, but in the end they had turned out well. He said he could hardly believe that their opponents had agreed to a knightly duel so easily, and concluded that despite their impressive appearance, they were ultimately just hot-headed youths. Viscount Jaden smiled and dismissed their enemies as nothing more than a knightly order hiding in some remote rural area. He claimed there was no way they could defeat the Black Bear Knights who had trained for 15 years. As he spoke, he turned toward a huge muscular man named Luchiano, the commander of the Black Bear Knights. Luchiano responded confidently that there was no reason to lose to lazy fools who stubbornly clung to outdated sword techniques. He said their opponent's dull style was obvious at a glance, and since they knew nothing about the Black Bear Knights, the outcome of the duel was already decided. At that moment, another man lowered his hood and spoke, saying that he would also like a turn. Viscount Jaden welcomed the offer, though he found it strange that the man had volunteered so suddenly. The speaker was Graham of the Delamian family from the Breton Republic. Graham explained that he had grown tired of merely following along and wanted to experience the great sword style that was praised as the finest in the kingdom of Reuben. Viscount Jaden secretly scoffed at Graham's arrogance. After sparring with his men, Graham had suddenly developed an interest in the ancestral great sword art. Turning away, Viscount Jaden told him that he would leave it in his hands. Graham replied casually, telling him to go and handle things properly. Viscount Jaden smiled to himself. No matter how events unfolded, this would be the end of the foolish main house. Whoever stepped forward, he intended to crush them all. Some time later at the castle gate, a Golden Bear Knight acting as referee raised his voice and announced the start of the nightly duel. Calling both sides to step forward, from Viscount Jaden's side Luchiano advanced, gripping his longsword. From Raul's side a man in his 40s stepped forward holding a ripper. When Luchiano saw him, he burst out laughing and mocked the Count's household, saying that they must have run out of talent if they were sending a retired old man to fight. The man replied calmly that despite all of Luchiano's loud boasting, he seemed no different from how he had been 16 years earlier. This made Luchiano grind his teeth in anger, and he threw an insult at the old man. Raul watched the exchange quietly from the side. The referee then ordered both fighters to get ready. They took their positions, and with a sharp command, the referee announced the start of the first match. Luchiano immediately swung his huge sword, sending a wave of red aura rushing toward his opponent. The old man drew his sword at once, avoided the attack with quick movement, and charged straight at Luchiano. He taunted him, asking if he was holding back because he was fighting a dying old man. Caught off guard, Luchiano attacked again and again, releasing one slash after another. The old man dodged every attack with ease. He scolded Luchiano, saying that his bad habit of swinging wildly when angered had not changed at all. Luchiano shouted back, telling him to be quiet and declaring that he would crush the Count's dull sword style with his own hands. As he spoke, he began to gather power for a strong thrust. The old man's face grew serious. A golden aura flowed out and wrapped around his sword. Luchiano lunged forward and a beam of red aura shot out in front of his blade. The old man stayed calm and did not move. When the red aura disappeared, he was still standing there without a scratch. He commented that Luchiano had clearly trained hard, and that he was copying the spear techniques of the Breton Republic. Luchiano smiled and praised the old man's sharp eye, but said it would not help him. The old man smiled back and said it had been a long time since he had felt like this. As he spoke, an even more golden aura poured from him, covering both his body and his sword. He added that the feeling of his blood burning was something he had not felt in many years. Raul watched the scene with a faint knowing smile. Seeing the wild mana gathering around the old man, Luchiano clenched his teeth and felt uneasy. He could clearly sense that the flow of the old man's mana had suddenly changed. He wondered in disbelief how a retired old man could use such power. Sir Zion then rushed forward to attack. Luchiano swung his sword to meet him, and their mana-covered blades crashed together with violent force. As their swords collided, Zion smiled to himself. His body felt incredibly light, as if he had returned to his youth. He believed this could only be a blessing from the gods given through Raul. His thoughts drifted back to earlier when he had stepped forward and asked Raul directly if he could take part in the nightly duel. Raul had immediately recognized him as Sir Zion and calmly explained that their enemies would surely send fighters who knew the Count family's sword style well. Honest and straightforward knights would fall easily to prepared counter techniques. Zion had replied that he did not mean to insult the Count family's 1,000-year sword tradition, but that in a situation like this, the experience of an old man might be needed. Raul had thought about Zion's past. He was the former vice-captain of the Golden Bear Knights and a top-level expert who had fought in many inter-kingdom duels and tournaments. In uncertain situations, very few could match his skill. Because of that, Raul had agreed right away. Even so, Weiron had felt uneasy about the decision. It was not that he doubted Zion's skill, but Zion had been retired for years, and his mana had weakened greatly. Weiron wondered whether Zion would truly be all right. Some time later, Zion stood alone and drew his sword, feeling a sharp pain shoot through his arm. At that moment, Raul approached him and asked for a brief moment. Before Zion could question it, Raul took his hand and a golden aura spread outward. Zion was shocked as warm glowing mana filled his body. In that instant he realized that the long-lasting pain in his arm had completely disappeared. His mind also felt clear and refreshed. What seemed impossible had become real, and he was convinced that the young lord had truly received the god's blessing and awakened. Back in the present duel, Zion pushed forward and drove Luchiano back with a powerful strike. Raul continued to watch silently from the side. It seemed that Zion truly believed the power he was using was divine. In reality, it was only Raul's radiant aura slightly strengthened by his abilities. Since Zion was not a guild member, the effect was weaker, but even that was more than enough. Zion released several mana slashes in rapid succession. Luchiano failed to block them all, and was forced down onto his knees swearing in rage. Zion calmly asked if that was really all Luchiano had, saying that after all these years his efforts seemed to have led to nothing. Luchiano angrily demanded to know what nonsense the old man was talking about. Zion told him to put a hand on his chest and think carefully. 16 years had passed since Luchiano left the Count's house. Zion asked whether Luchiano could truly say he had lived as fiercely as he had back then. Luchiano clenched his teeth as anger rose inside him. In his mind, he rejected the idea completely. He believed his life had been far more meaningful than staying in the countryside and endlessly hunting monsters. Memories of the Count's house filled him with bitterness. Non-stop training, sleepless missions to forbidden zones, constant battles with monsters, and no real recognition even after risking his life. To him, leaving had been the right choice. It had to be. Suddenly, the tattoo on Luciano's neck began to glow. His mana surged violently, shaking the air as he shouted that he had not been wrong. Jake and the other knights stiffened in alarm at the sight. Zion stared in shock, realizing that Raul's earlier warning had been true. He clearly remembered Raul saying that even with a blessing, Zion must never lower his guard. The enemy would surely hide a trump card and reveal it only when cornered. Only by staying alert would an opening appear. Returning to the present, Zion moved into a defensive stance. He grimly thought that their final move was the Emperor's tattoo, and that he had never imagined they would actually use such a taboo. Luchiano, now wrapped in overwhelming mana that covered both his body and his sword, declared that he would end everything in a single strike. Whereon turned to Raul in worry, warning that if this continued, Sir Zion would be in danger. Luchiano swung his sword with terrifying force. Zion barely managed to dodge, leaping backwards to create distance. As he steadied himself, he realized that Luciano's power was now on a completely different level. By burning both life force and mana, the enemy had gained a huge advantage in a short fight. Zion forced himself to stay calm. He believed that the opportunity would come just as Raul had said. Taking a deep breath, he raised his sword and settled into his stance again. He resolved not to betray the trust Raul had placed in him and to claim victory in return. Seeing this unshakable resolve, a small, satisfied smile appeared on Raul's face. The battlefield shook as the mana blades of Luchiano and Zion collided, sending explosions and clouds of dust into the air. Each strike scattered debris across the field, forcing the watching knights to brace themselves, expecting stones to fall. However, to their confusion, the debris stopped in midair, held back by Raul's power. Raul thought that he now had a rough understanding of the situation and directed his psychic power toward Zion to support him. He decided it was time to test the results gained from the Jack's dungeon. Zion prepared for the next strike, but this time he could not dodge Luciano's attack on his own. To his surprise, Raul's power supported him. As if an invisible wind was pushing him forward, Zion wondered what this strange feeling was, noting that dodging had never felt this easy. It felt as though the goddess of victory herself was standing behind him, protecting him. Watching from the side, Raul reflected on his telekinesis enhancement technique. Until now, he had only used it to strengthen his own body. Because the power relied on spiritual energy, he had not been able to project it onto others with souls. But that was no longer the case. With Raul's support, Zion blocked Luciano's next attack head-on. In a swift counterattack, Zion severed Luciano's sword arm. Luchiano screamed in pain as both his arm and sword fell to the ground. As he collapsed to his knees, he shouted that he was not wrong before losing consciousness. Viscount Jaden's eyes widened in shock. Around him, Raul's knights cheered and praised Zion's victory. Zion, ever disciplined, immediately went to Raul and saluted. Following the Viscount's orders, he reported that he had returned victorious from the first duel. Raul nodded in approval and said it had been a splendid duel, commending Zion on behalf of the Count's family. Raul then turned his attention to Viscount Jaden and wondered what he would do next. A grim smile crossed Viscount Jaden's face as he ground his teeth in anger. Moments later, the referee announced the next duel and summoned both knights forward. From Raul's side, Baron Carlo stepped out and introduced himself as Carlo de Ashton, commander of the Silver Bear Knights. From Viscount Jaden's side, Graham stepped forward and casually said that he could be called Ray for now. Baron Carlo bristled at the disrespect, thinking it was rude not to reveal one's true identity in a knightly duel, and wondering how someone like that dared to challenge the Ashton Count's family. The referee quickly stepped in and told both sides to prepare, announcing that the duel would begin shortly. Raul watched quietly, thinking that it was Ray again and recalling how he had insisted on a fair match earlier. His gaze settled on Graham and he noted that it had been a long time since he had last seen him. Wondering when he would finally make his move, Raul checked his status window. It showed Graham, age 46, level 89, a veteran swordmaster connected to the Kingdom of Reuben, Baron Hans, the Brennan Republic and House Delamian. Raul remembered that Graham had been present during a past incident at the capital mansion where he had proved to be a very dangerous opponent. Raul wondered how he was doing now. The duel began. Graham jumped into the air with a sword in each hand and slashed down at Baron Carlo. Carlo blocked the attack with his long sword and sparks flew as their blades collided. Raul thought that Graham was clearly powerful, but Carlo was strong as well. Carlo shifted into a defensive stance and then rushed forward. Graham barely managed to block the attack and smiled as he activated a tattoo. He felt satisfied and thought that this truly matched the kingdom's strongest swordsmanship, but he also believed the fight was about to end. Mana surged around Graham as he moved at extreme speed, circling Carlo and leaving many afterimages in his wake. Graham believed that unlike the reckless Luchiano, he could control this power properly. He thought that when dual swords moved this fast, the opponent would eventually expose an opening, and a single moment of distraction would mean death. Carlo tightened his grip and his sword shook slightly as Graham prepared to strike again. Graham shifted position with incredible speed and closed in from behind. He believed Carlo had exposed an opening, and thought that Carlo would regret it in hell. Graham swung his sword with lethal accuracy. Blood splashed as Carlo's blade met Graham's attack, and the force sent Graham falling to the ground. Raul's Golden Bear Knights were shocked by what they saw. Carlo clenched his teeth and shouted angrily, criticizing Graham's flashy but shallow movements and calling him an idiot. Graham lay defeated on the ground as Baron Carlo turned back toward the Count's side. The knights burst into cheers at Carlo's victory, and Raul smiled slightly in approval. In his heart, he calmly accepted the result, knowing that a top 10 active knight of the Count's family would not fall so easily. With only one round left, the Knights' Duel was heading toward an overwhelming victory for their side. At the same time, inside Viscount Jaden's tent, rage exploded. He threw the papers off his desk, and his furious shouting made the guards outside tremble in fear. He could not accept that both fighters he had sent out had been completely defeated. This result, he believed, should never have happened. Just then, 2 Black Bear Knights entered the tent. One stepped forward in a hurry, begging to be sent out and promising certain victory. The other claimed to know the Count family's swordsmanship well and also asked for a chance to fight. Viscount Jaden shouted at them to be quiet and reminded them that even Luchiano had been utterly defeated by the Count's side. He demanded to know why they thought they could succeed where Luchiano had failed. Still, he knew this duel had to be won at any cost. The 2 knights fell silent, their confidence crushed. Then Viscount Jaden's son entered the tent. Calm and composed, he said that he had a way to change the flow of the duel and asked his father to entrust the match to him. Jaden hesitated, knowing that if they lost now, everything would be over. However, he needed to reverse the situation by any means necessary. In the end, he agreed and ordered his son to go and win, no matter what methods he used. The young man bowed and promised he would not disappoint him. Inside Conferred Castle, Raul stood with Zion, Carlo, Weyron, and another knight. He was about to choose the next fighter when a Golden Bear Knight from the gate approached and apologized for the interruption, asking Raul to step outside for a moment. Confused, Raul climbed the castle wall with the others and looked beyond the gate. Below them stood Viscount Jaden's son, shouting the same words again and again. He introduced himself as Titus de Ashton, the heir of Viscount Jaden and a senior knight of the Black Bear Knights, and said that he had something to say to Raul de Ashton of Conferred Castle. The guards explained that he had been shouting like this for quite some time. Raul called down from the wall and asked what Titus wanted. Titus looked up and accused Raul of acting unjustly in the name of House Ashton. He challenged Raul to decide right and wrong with their swords. Raul calmly asked whether Titus was the 3rd knight representing Viscount Jaden's side. Titus denied it and insisted that this was a personal duel, unrelated to the Knights' Duel. Hearing this, Raul turned away and refused the challenge outright. He questioned what right Titus had to issue such a challenge when he did not even hold a proper title. Titus was left stunned. Raul had seemed hot-blooded, yet he rejected the duel without hesitation. Realizing that the Knights' Duel was turning against them, Titus decided to disrupt it by any means necessary. He believed that if Raul de Ashton, the one responsible, could be taken out, the situation might still be saved. Acting quickly, Titus shouted again and declared himself the 3rd duel knight. He mocked Raul, daring him to fight and claiming that a true descendant of the prestigious Ashton Count's family would not fear defeat. Raul stopped and turned back immediately. If Titus was truly the 3rd contestant, then the situation had changed. Raul accepted the duel. Titus smiled darkly, convinced that Raul had fallen into his trap. Zion immediately showed his worry and urged Raul not to accept the duel. They already had the advantage, and it would be safer to let other knights handle it. He believed that Raul stepping forward himself was far too dangerous. Raul calmly reassured him and asked him to trust him, reminding him that he was the one who had received a divine blessing. Some time later, the duel began. Raul and Titus stood facing each other with their swords drawn. Titus lowered himself into a fighting stance, while Raul calmly checked his status window. Titus was 28 years old, a level 69 mid-level sword expert from the Kingdom of Reuben, and a subordinate of Viscount Jaden's house. His abilities were strong, supported by his noble bloodline traits and sharp instincts. Raul silently admitted that Titus was truly talented. He was not even 30 yet, and had already reached mid-level expert. If Titus activated his tattoo, very few people his age could compete with him. Titus, however, sneered to himself. Raul was standing too openly, leaving what looked like many openings. He believed that arrogance had its limits. Whatever Raul had achieved during the night ceremony meant nothing to him. Raul was still only a mid-level expert, and even geniuses could not reach mastery so quickly. Feeling sure of his victory, Titus activated his tattoo. In the next moment, Raul swung his sword and released mana slashes. Titus froze in shock as he felt the crushing pressure behind the attack. He realized in horror that Raul had been hiding his true strength. Raul had already reached the upper-level expert stage, so powerful that Titus could not even touch a single strand of his hair. Even with his tattoo active, Titus was struck again and again by Raul's mana slashes, which sent him flying backwards before he crashed into the ground. Viscount Jaden watched the scene in disbelief, completely stunned. Raul walked up to the kneeling Titus and calmly asked whether he admitted defeat, holding his sword to Titus's head. While coughing blood, Titus admitted his loss without argument and accepted it cleanly. Raul put his sword away and turned around, stating that the night's duel was over. He said he would now receive the official declaration of defeat from Viscount Jaden. However, as Raul turned his back, Titus's voice sounded behind him. Although the duel had been lost, Titus claimed it was not finished. With a desperate snarl, he suddenly jumped forward from behind and swung his blade downward, declaring that Raul would die as well. Raul sensed the attack at the very last moment and looked back.